48-year-old John Mike Wrights lived in Lewis and Clark County, Montana. He went missing in June of 2011. In October of the same year, his remains were found in plastic bags on the east side of McDonald Pass. An autopsy revealed that John was shot twice in the back of the head. Investigators found that he had been involved in long-running disputes with several of his neighbors. The police questioned them all, but did not really find any useful information that would lead them to the person who took John's life. There was one man who sparked the interest of the investigators: Leon Michael Ford. He was one of the neighbors of John. They had argued a lot about Leon not always having access to his property because of John. A game camera belonging to another neighbor shows Leon's car on John's property on the 25th of June 2011. Leon told police that they had reached an agreement regarding the access. It was just a few days later, on the 28th of June, that John disappeared. Investigators were highly suspicious of Leon, but they could not prove that he was involved with John's life being taken. They did not give up, however, and continued their investigation. Investigators found cable ties at all of the locations that John's remains were found. The specific type was last produced in September of 2011. The manufacturer told investigators that the ties were only available to specific distributors. Investigators then found records from a contractor at a naval air station, Whidbey Island, where Leon worked, that Leon took some of those ties from a warehouse. There were no identification of what project he was going to use them for. Investigators that looked into the case files recently found that Leon had lied about a lot of details initially. Investigators also claim to have concrete evidence that Leon took John's life and then tampered with evidence. But frustratingly, the details of the evidence has not been made public yet. Leon was arrested in September of 2020 in Washington. He was then taken to Montana. His hearing is set for early in 2021. "17-year-old Barbara Blatnik lived in Cleveland, Ohio. She attended Erie View Catholic High School. Barbara was known as Barbie by some of her friends. When she was not hitchhiking to see her favorite rock and roll bands such as AC/DC and Led Zeppelin, she could be found out with her friends around the Garfield Heights area. On December 19, 1987, she was at a bar with her friends in Garfield Heights. At about 8 p.m., they stopped at a friend's house to drink and hang out some more. At around 10 p.m., she called her parents to let them know she was headed home. She never arrived home, however. Her parents did not report her missing, as it was not unusual for her to sleep over at a friend's house instead. The next morning, however, her body was found alongside a narrow access road that leads to Blossom Music Center in Cuyahoga Falls. Barbara had been assaulted and strangled. The Cuyahoga Falls Police Department asked the public for any information and for witnesses to come forward, but no one did. All they could do was collect DNA from Barbara's body that belonged to the suspect. It was found under her fingernails, indicating that she put up a fight. There were no leads and the case went cold. Then in 2019, the police announced that they reopened the case and they were teaming up with Project Porchlight, who raised $6,000 for DNA testing. The DNA evidence that was taken from Barbara's body were then provided to Identifinders. It is a Californian company that does forensic genealogy using DNA databases. This led investigators to 67-year-old James E. Zastovnik, who lived in Cleveland, Ohio. They went to arrest him at his home in April 2020. Barbara's sister Donna said that she was in shock that an arrest has been made after all this time. Donna also shared the news on Facebook with family and friends who were equally stunned and pleased. She said that no one in the family has ever heard of or seen the suspect before. It is unknown why he did what he did to Barbara. Not much is known about James Zastovnik. It was revealed that 2 of his brothers served time for a very similar crime, and that he has another brother who went missing around the time that he took the life of Barbara. James is currently being held on a $1 million bond. On April 16, 1997, Orange County policemen were dispatched to 2002 Lee Street for a possible burglary. A homeowner called the police after finding a broken window in the apartment that is connected to her home. Inside the apartment, a woman's body was found wrapped up on the floor of the bedroom. She had been strangled. Investigators used her fingerprints to identify her as 42-year-old Orlando resident Donna Byrd. They looked into her record and found that Donna had been arrested at least 20 times for prostitution in the years leading up to her life being taken. Donna would often look for vacant locations to meet up with men. At a crime scene there were fingerprints that were found, but it could not be determined if the fingerprints belonged to her or a possible suspect. The leads dried up and the case soon went cold. The Orange County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit recently reopened the case. They decided to submit the fingerprints again that was found at a crime scene back in 1997. In September 2020, a match was finally made. It led them to 51-year-old Jimmy Mahone, who lives in Macon, Georgia. He was arrested in October of 2020. Jimmy was questioned and then taken to the jail. He then had to wait to be extradited to Orange County. In November, he was transferred from a prison in Bibb County, Georgia, to Orlando. Jimmy is currently held in the Orange County Jail on a $100,000 bond. "18-year-old Michelle Missy Jones lived in Fontana, California in 1980. She was considered popular. Michelle helped start a yearbook club at Park West Continuation School before graduating. She also landed a job as Claremont Police Dispatcher. Michelle was last seen by her siblings getting ready for a July 4th get-together. The next morning, on the 5th, her parents started to worry when they noticed she had not returned home after going out the previous evening. They started calling her friends, but no one knew where Michelle was. Her parents then had to report her missing. The police received an anonymous tip about a body in a grapefruit grove at Live Oak and Santa Ana Avenue. They found Michelle's body there. She had been assaulted before her life was taken. Evidence was collected and leads were investigated, but the case went cold. Early in 2020, the case was reopened. DNA samples collected by detectives decades ago were reanalyzed. Detectives also conducted more interviews. Some of Michelle's family members felt that a man by the name of Leonard Nash should be looked into. Leonard was the boyfriend of Michelle's sister Melissa at the time her life was taken in 1980. A DNA sample was then taken from Leonard and it matched the DNA of the suspect that was found at the crime scene. On September 8, 2020, 66-year-old Leonard Nash, who now lives in Las Vegas, was arrested. Melissa had this to say after hearing of the arrest. "I'm angry that he got to walk free for 40 freaking years, and my sister was at the start of her life. She never did anything to hurt anyone." On September 19, Michelle's family members gathered around her gravesite. They shared stories and passed around old photos of her. They then released 40 balloons into the air, one for each year they should have had together. Jonelle Matthews was born in 1972 in Santa Barbara, California. After she was born, her family moved to Colorado. On the evening of December 20, 1984, 12-year-old Jonelle was performing in a holiday concert at Intro West Bank of Denver as a member of the Greeley's Franklin Middle School Choir. Her family was not present at the concert. Her father was at his other daughter's basketball game. Her mom was with Jonelle's ill grandfather. At 8:15 p.m., Jonelle arrived home. She got a ride home from her friend's father. 15 minutes after arriving home, Jonelle answered her phone and took a message for her father. That was the last time anyone spoke to Jonelle. Her father arrived home just after 9 p.m. He found the garage door open, but no one inside the house. He got very worried and called the police. They found footprints in the snow, indicating that someone had looked into the windows. There were no signs of a struggle or forced entry. Her disappearance attracted a lot of public interest. President Ronald Reagan even mentioned her once in a speech. Despite this, the case went cold for many years. On July 23, 2019, excavators installing a pipeline found human remains. This was about 15 miles from Jonelle's home. The remains were positively identified as being those of Jonelle Matthews. The next big development in the case came in October of 2020, when 69-year-old Stephen D. Pankey was arrested. He used to live in Colorado, but now lives in Idaho. According to the police, Stephen had long been a person of interest in Jonelle's disappearance. He intentionally inserted himself in the investigation many times over the years, claiming to have knowledge of the crime. What he told police grew inconsistent and incriminating over time, and finally led to his arrest. Why Stephen kidnapped Jonelle and ended her life is still not known. "19-year-old Lorraine Snell lived in Brooklyn, New York in 1980. She worked as a legal secretary. On September 25, 1980, Lorraine's body was found, strangled, in the back of a station wagon behind a supermarket on Newkirk Avenue in Brooklyn. Investigators were able to collect DNA belonging to a suspect under Lorraine's nails. DNA technology was not really advanced, however, and they had to store it to be used later. They also conducted a lot of interviews with family and friends of Lorraine. Lorraine's cousin had a husband by the name of James Burris. James became a prime suspect after the interviews. James told investigators that he saw Lorraine the night before her body was found. He also told them that he walked her home for a bit because it was raining. The station wagon was behind a supermarket where James worked at the time. The car belonged to James's boss at the supermarket. He later admitted to robbing a cab the same night Lorraine lost her life. James ended up going to prison for robbing the cab. When he was released from jail, he became a preacher. Despite investigators being confident that James was responsible, they never could prove it. But then, early in 2020, James's DNA was positively associated with foreign DNA found under Lorraine's fingernails. James was arrested in March of 2020. Lorraine's mom was 42 years old when her daughter passed away. She turned 82 years old in September. She is relieved to know that the case is now finally solved. Rachel Johnson was a single mom who lived in Akron, Ohio in 1991. In March of the same year, she had been in a friend's vehicle when they got a flat tire. They pulled into the parking lot of a convenience store at the corner of Dan Street and Glenwood Avenue. A small faded grey vehicle pulled into the lot behind them. Rachel got into that vehicle and drove off with the man. It is believed that a man offered to take her home. However, later in the day, her body was discovered on Weller Avenue. She was assaulted, stabbed multiple times, and even set on fire after being dumped in a street. Investigators collected DNA evidence from Rachel's body. They entered it into databases but did not find a match. It was only recently, in 2019, when the Akron Police Department partnered with Advanced DNA that a match could be made. Advanced DNA is a genetic testing company in Texas that has helped solve a lot of cases recently. In March of 2020, 57-year-old Daniel Lee Reese was arrested in connection with the case. His DNA matched the suspect's DNA that was found at the crime scene back in 1991. Daniel, who would have been 28 years old at the time of the crime, is currently in a Summit County jail. He is apparently known to Rachel's family. Daniel had been spotted in the same area she was last seen alive, but he was never looked into in the original investigation. Daniel also lived right across the street. After he took Rachel's life, he would often spend time with her daughter, who went to live with Rachel's mother. The daughter never expected that this man she knew from childhood was the man who took her mom's life. Detective James Basilich said that DNA was the key to solving this case. That's what broke the case. He also said that it was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. In this case, we have 14-year-old Wendy Jerome lived in Rochester, New York in 1984. She was last seen on Thanksgiving Day, November 22nd. Wendy went to deliver a card to a friend who lived nearby. It was around 7 p.m. She had to be home by 8. When Wendy did not return home by 8 p.m., her parents got worried and called the police. Just a few hours later, their worst fears were confirmed. A passerby found Wendy's body in an alcove behind a school near her home. She had been assaulted and beaten. DNA evidence was collected from her body. It was entered into the CODIS database, but no matches were made. When trying to create a DNA profile, they could determine that a suspect was a black man, but they could not narrow it down. The police investigated hundreds of leads and hunches, but all of them led nowhere, and the case went cold. Then recently, the Rochester Police Department got the idea to use genetic genealogy to help solve the case. Using DNA from the suspect that was found at a crime scene, they were able to build his family tree. Eventually, they narrowed their search down to just one man, 56-year-old Timothy Williams, who lives in Melbourne, Florida. Timothy was arrested in September of 2020 at his home. He was 20 years old at the time of the crime. He lived in Rochester, close to Wendy's home. The two of them did not know each other, according to investigators. Wendy's mom thanked the police for never giving up on the investigation, even as the original detectives on the case retired and the trail went cold. "I never thought I would see this day, and now it is here. I just wish my husband had been alive to see this. He passed away in 2011, and I know he's up there with her, smiling and saying, 'It is over. It is finally over.'" In October of 2020, Timothy pleaded not guilty, but there are no doubt in investigators' minds that he will be found guilty and that justice will be served. District Attorney Julie Hahn, who has been working in the case since 2011, said that when she was 11 years old, her mom told her about the case of Wendy Jerome. That horrific story helped direct her career choice. "I decided I want to be an attorney that gives a voice to the victims of crime." On May 23, 1992, a woman's body was found dumped behind a partially constructed shed in North Memorial Drive, just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. She was quickly identified as 31-year-old Kim Marlene McVey. Kim had been shot in the head. There were no known witnesses to the crime and no DNA evidence. No one came forward with useful information, and the case went cold. But then recently, witnesses did come forward. They told police that a man by the name of Tommy Edward Harris confessed to them that he took the life of Kim. Kim, Tommy, and a few other unnamed people were staying in the same house. The house was described as a known drug house. On May 16, 1992, 7 days before her body was found, a man entered the house to settle a deal that has gone bad. This individual wanted to get his money back. A gun battle then occurred. This man took Kim in a headlock and dragged her outside. The man then made demands of Tommy Harris. Tommy fired a gun and it struck Kim in the left temple. Tommy then dragged her body into the house and later hid her remains behind a shed out back. Tommy was arrested on May 14, 2020. Tulsa County Sheriff Vic Recolado said this is a bittersweet moment. Bitter in the fact that Kim McVey still has family. They have been notified. They are out of state and were unable to be here today. Our hearts certainly go out to them. Sweet in the fact that we have now been able to provide closure to a family. It was years in the making, but again, at the end of the day, justice, sometimes slow moving, still happens. The man who entered the house looking for money has since passed away. Kim's family, who did not attend the police briefing, also have not yet made a statement after hearing about the arrest. Christine Susan Munro lived in Redding, California. She worked as a nurse and had 4 children. 37-year-old Christine loved to go running. In June of 1995, she went for a run in a Sacramento River trail. When Christine did not return home after her run, her family got worried and they called the police. Her body was found on June 24, 1995, alongside the trail where she was last seen running. Christine had been assaulted and stabbed. Investigators were able to collect DNA of the suspect from Christine's body. In 1997, 2 years after the crime, a man by the name of Michael Valbick started claiming that he took the life of Christine. Investigators noticed immediately that he was fabricating his story and ruled him out as a suspect. Redding Police Detective Rusty Bishop began reviewing Christine's case in late 2019. In January of 2020, he resubmitted fingernail scrapings of Christine to the Department of Justice for DNA analysis. In June of 2020, the detective received a notification that a possible match has been made using the CODIS database. It matched the DNA of James Watkins. In August, Redding detectives flew to Texas to interview James. He lives in Texas, but he was in Redding, California at the time of the crime. James was just 17 years old when the crime took place. He has been serving a 14-year prison sentence for robbery in a state prison in Beaumont, Texas. The 2 years he spent living in Redding, he had lots of run-ins with the police. Right after he took Christine's life, he moved to Texas to live with his uncle, where he continued to commit crimes. They took DNA samples from James, and in October it was confirmed that the DNA of the suspect found under Christine's fingernails matched the DNA of James Watkins. In November, 42-year-old James Watkins was arrested. Christine's daughter Lisa spoke at a news conference where James' arrest was announced. Not a single day goes by that I don't think about the day my mom's life was taken, the manner in which she was taken from us, and the pain this has caused our family. There are simply no words to describe the sadness and grief our family has experienced. She left a river trail, and I take comfort in knowing she passed away in the place she loved so much. Denise Pflum lived in Connersville, Indiana in 1986. She had a bright future ahead of her. Denise was a star athlete, a gifted artist, and ranked at the top of her class. She had dreams of becoming a scientist. Denise was about to graduate high school and had already been accepted to Miami University, where she planned to major in microbiology. On March 27, 1986, Denise went with her friends to a nearby farm to attend a party. The next day she realized that she forgot her handbag at the site of the party. She left her home to go retrieve it. Denise never returned home, however. No one knew if she met with foul play or if she decided to run away. Investigators questioned her friends and family, trying to see if anyone knew anything. One of the people they questioned was Sean McClung. Sean was Denise's ex-boyfriend. They dated for a couple of years and broke up just before her disappearance. After the two of them broke up, Denise became a lot more social, and she was hanging out with her friends more. A few days after her disappearance, her cream-colored 1981 Buick Regal was found alongside Tower Road, just a few miles from the farm. There was nothing in the car that indicated what happened to Denise or where she may have went. Sheriff Joey Laughlin, who was just 7 years old when Denise disappeared, eventually took on the case. In July of 2020, Joey conducted another interview with Denise's ex-boyfriend, 56-year-old Sean McClung. Sean was incarcerated for defrauding a financial institution and check deception. This time, Sean admitted that he took the life of Denise. Investigators added that investigation is still ongoing and that no more comments will be made at this time. We do know, however, that Sean did not state where Denise's body is. We also don't know why he did what he did. The odds are we will never know, because on September 26, 2020, Sean McClung could no longer cling onto life and he passed away. He spent about a week at an Indianapolis hospital dealing with an undisclosed illness before passing. Denise's mom, Judy, had this to say: "She had everything going for her. If she were here today, she'd be working on a cure for cancer. Or well, maybe even a cure for this coronavirus. She just wanted to help people." The family released a statement on Facebook. "We appreciate all of the love and support that you have shown us. We appreciate that Denise has become like family to all of you. Our daughter was a special person whom we will never forget, and we know that this community will not forget. We are so grateful for all of those who have followed her story, who have helped with the investigation, and who have shown support and love." "17-year-old Paige Johnson lived in Covington, Kentucky. She had a young daughter. In September of 2010, Paige attended a party in Covington with her friends. Also in attendance was 22-year-old Jacob Bumpus. Paige was last seen climbing into Jacob's car. When Paige did not arrive home, her family got worried and called the police. Investigators talked to Jacob as he was presumably the last person to have seen her. He told them that he dropped her off at 15th and Scott Street in Covington at around 1 a.m. Investigators used his phone to determine that he was lying. His phone pinged at Florence, Kentucky at the time he says he dropped Paige off. His phone also pinged at East Fort Lake just after 4:15 a.m. Jacob refused to give a reason for him lying, and he also refused to take a lie detector test. Rumors soon started to spread about multiple friends at a party seeing Paige passed out and carried out by Jacob to his car. Investigators were sure that Jacob knew more than he was telling them, but they could not prove it, and the case went cold. The next update in the case would come on the 25th of March 2020. Hunters in Clermont County, Ohio, found what appeared to be a burnt human skull in the woods. They called the police. Additional human remains were found nearby. Using dental records, the remains were positively identified as Paige Johnson's. Jacob's cell phone pinging in East Fork Lake now became very important. East Fork Lake is in Clermont County, Ohio. It is still not known how Paige lost her life, but investigators now have enough evidence to know Jacob is involved. He was indicted on charges of abuse of a corpse and tampering of evidence in connection to Paige's disappearance and passing. 32-year-old Jacob was arrested in July of 2020 and taken into custody during a traffic stop. Jacob still denies any involvement. Kenton County Commonwealth's attorney Rob Sanders said, "It is obviously possible that additional charges could come in the future. The hope is that Jacob would confess and tell investigators what exactly happened back in 2010. Elizabeth Ann Elder was born in Hood River, Oregon in 1959. She was adopted when she was 2 years old and renamed Elizabeth Ann Roberts, but went by Lisa. She was raised in Roseburg, Oregon. On July 25, 1977, 17-year-old Lisa was reported as missing by her father. Lisa had run away from home. A few days after leaving, she called her parents from Everett, Washington, asking for money. Her parents sent the money, but it was never picked up, and they never heard from Lisa again. On August 14, 1977, blackberry pickers found a young woman's body in Everett, Washington. The woman had been strangled and shot in the head multiple times. She carried no purse, no driver's license, and few clues to her past. Investigators could not identify her. She was nicknamed Precious Jane Doe. A man by the name of David Marvin Roth came forward and confessed to taking the life of Precious Jane Doe. He claimed that 5 days before her body was found, he picked up a hitchhiker. She refused his advances, and he decided to take her life. Investigators now knew who took her life, but still they did not know her identity, as David did not know her name either. In 2008, her remains were exhumed from Cypress Lawn Cemetery in Everett. They were hoping to identify her using DNA. The lab could not create a full genetic profile using her bones. A partial genetic profile was entered into the CODIS database, but no match could be found. Recently, a paleontologist from California acquired a useful genetic profile from the hair. It was then shared on public ancestry sites such as GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. Precious Jane Doe's family tree could then be rebuilt, but for some unknown reason, investigators could not come closer than a third cousin. Genealogist Barbara Ray Fenter started working on the case in June of 2020. She quickly managed to pinpoint Precious Jane Doe's family in Oregon. Detectives got into touch with a man who they believed was the girl's biological older half-brother. He was adopted by another family and shared his DNA on Ancestry.com. A genetic comparison suggested that his long-lost half-sister was Elizabeth Elder. It took another week after that realization to find out that Elizabeth was adopted by the Roberts family, and her name was changed to Elizabeth Ann Roberts. Investigators could then finally inform her adoptive parents what happened to Lisa. They also now knew that Precious Jane Doe's real name was Elizabeth Ann Roberts. There were lots of factors that played a part in the case taking so long to get solved. Investigators believed that Precious Jane Doe was in her 30s. Lisa being adopted made finding her using DNA an even harder process. The clay reconstruction of Precious Jane Doe looking like this certainly did not help either, I'm sure. There is not a lot of information about this case. I was not even able to find a photo of the victim. 74-year-old Mabel Herman lived in Willmar, Minnesota. On January 27, 1974, her family tried to enter her home after she did not return their calls for a few days. Inside, they found Mabel's lifeless body on a living room floor. She had been stabbed over 20 times. The nature of the crime indicated it was someone who knew Mabel. Nothing was stolen from the house, so the motive did not seem to be robbery. Investigators found blood on Mabel's sweater that did not belong to her. Back in 1974, not much was known about DNA, and they had no way of testing whose blood it is. Willmar resident Algene Vossen soon became a suspect. He was lurking in the area and frequently tried to create a ruse so that he could enter people's home. Investigators believed that it is very possible that he was responsible for the crime. He was interviewed but denied any involvement in the case. In June of 2020, Willmar Police Department set up a temporary cold case review unit to help solve cold cases, including Mabel Herman's case. The team decided to send her sweater in for DNA analysis. A clear DNA profile of the suspect was then created. They then learned Algene Vossen now lived in Sioux Falls. A DNA sample from his was collected in July of 2020. In the same month, the results of the test came back and confirmed that Algene's DNA matched the DNA of the suspect found at the crime scene. On July 23, 2020, Algene Vossen was arrested at his home. It is not clear yet what his motive was for taking the life of Mabel Herman. Perry Griffin lived in Dothan, Alabama, and worked for Panhandle Converters and Scrap. On June 26, 2007, Griffin was ready to go out of town to buy items for the business. He had a large amount of cash on him, as he had done numerous other times. In the early morning hours, as he was prepared to leave the parking lot of the business, two armed suspects confronted him. During a physical struggle, a suspect fired his weapon, and he fatally wounded Griffin. The two suspects then fled the scene on foot, after they took all of the money Griffin had with him. It is believed that another suspect was waiting nearby in a vehicle. Persons of interest were developed and countless interviews were conducted by the police. Despite all of the efforts being put in by investigators, there was a lack of evidence and the case went cold. Then, in June of 2020, new information surfaced about the case. Several people were interviewed again. As a result of the new investigation and efforts during the original investigation, sufficient evidence has now been gathered to arrest suspects in the case. 48-year-old Kevin Sean Thornton, 47-year-old Jesse Jerome Swain, and 30-year-old Kendrick Fitzgerald Bryant. The Dauphin Police Department would like to thank many agencies for their assistance in this case, to include the Federal Bureau of Investigations and the U.S. Marshals Gulf Coast Regional Fugitive Task Force. The new information had led to the arrest of these men has not yet been made public, but the motive of the crime was robbery. 11-year-old Julie Fuller lived in Arlington, Texas in 1983. Her family did not live in a very safe area. They had recently moved from Essex, England to America. Julie was described as a well-mannered and optimistic child who enjoyed the differences of America. On June 27, 1983, Julie's father Colin, who worked as an engineer at CPI Electrics, got his first paycheck and wanted to celebrate by going out with his wife Janet and his children. While the rest of the family were getting dressed, Julie decided to take out the trash. She was barefoot and dressed in a white skirt and white blouse. The dumpster was full, so she decided to go to the back of the motel they lived in to find an empty one. When she did not return back home, her family got worried and she was reported as missing. The police and some locals spent all night looking for her, but then the next day the body of a young girl was found by construction workers 15 miles from the motel. The body was determined to be that of Julie Fuller. She had been assaulted and strangled. The police interviewed tenants of the motel. They also talked to known offenders in the area who have committed similar crimes, but they had no suspect. Julie was buried in a local cemetery and her family moved back to England. Colin Fuller told the media that the American dream was a nightmare. 2 months after the crime, an intoxicated man in his 40s confessed to the crime, but it was later revealed to be a hoax. The DNA of the suspect that was collected from Julie's body was entered into the CODIS database, but it turned up no results. In 2018, DNA was submitted to Parabon Nanolabs. It was used to create a digital snapshot of the suspect. Unfortunately, this did not bring in any tips. Then recently, the DNA was entered into genetic genealogy database, where a relative of the suspect was identified. Investigators contacted the relative, and with his help, they finally narrowed their search down to James McNichols. James passed away in 2004 in Iowa. He lived in the same area as Julie at the time of the crime. He had a criminal record, but for some reason, it was not entered into any criminal database. Otherwise, this case would have been solved long ago. Detective Thomas O'Brien, who worked the case, commented that he wished James was still alive so he could be held accountable for his crime. On August 12, 1986, a woman's body was found in a swamp in Green Bay, Wisconsin. The woman had been assaulted and strangled. She was quickly identified as 22-year-old Lisa Holstead. Lisa had a 5-year-old son named Jeremy. The investigation never really had any direction, and the case sadly went cold. In 2018, Green Bay investigators sent a DNA sample of the suspect that was collected from Lisa's body to a testing company. Genetic genealogy uses DNA evidence from the scene to find a suspect's relatives, and then investigators can narrow that list down to the suspect. Green Bay Police Detective David Graff described the process as basically doing a family tree in reverse. Using this technique, they finally found the man they were looking for. They wanted to be 100% sure. So on September 15, 2020, investigators collected DNA from beer cans and cigarettes that were used by the suspect. The results of the test confirmed that this man's DNA matched the DNA that was found at the crime scene. His name is Lou Griffin. He lived in Green Bay at the time Lisa's life was taken. Investigators could not find any connection between Lisa and Lou. He had a long history of violence against women. When interviewed by police, Lou denied any involvement. A $1 million cash bond was issued for Lou. He's due back in court on December 10, 2020. 16-year-old Ameenah Scott lived in West Oakland, California in 1981. She was described as a friendly and quiet teen. Ameenah attended McClymonds High School, where she was an honor student and took courses at UC Berkeley on the side. Ameenah was really interested in mathematics and had plans to go into computer science. The 16-year-old was last seen on December 23, 1981, when she left her home to go for a walk. Before leaving her home, she told her mom that she would be alright going for the walk on her own. Ameenah never made it back home, however. The next day, at 8 a.m., her body was found in the parking lot between Lowell Middle School and Lowell Park. Ameenah had been assaulted and stabbed. Investigators collected DNA from her body that they believed belonged to the person who took her life. Friends and family of Ameenah were questioned, but no useful information came to light, and the case went cold. In 2019, investigators decided to take another look into the case. To the surprise of the investigators, when they ran the DNA evidence through their system, a match was made. It matched the DNA of 57-year-old Jewel Henry Collins. Collins was serving a prison term in Nevada for an assault. At the time of the crime, Collins lived in Oakland and worked as a janitor. When investigators talked to him, he denied any involvement. DNA does not lie, however, and he was charged with the crime in September of 2019. In April of 2020, he was extradited to Alameda County. Ameenah's mom, Mercedes, is happy that there will now be justice. She said that she still has the electric blanket that she bought for Ameenah for Christmas that Ameenah never got to use. People still come up to Mercedes and talk about Ameenah and the good memories they have of her. This is one of the oldest cold cases to be solved by the Oakland police. Alameda County District Attorney Nancy O'Malley said that they never gave up solving this tragic case. The young victim's family has had to suffer decades of grief, and we hope that this prosecution will provide at least a sense of closure and relief that justice will be served. 17-year-old Gladys Arrelano lived in Boyle Heights, Los Angeles in 1996. She was beautiful, intelligent, and had big dreams for the future. Gladys was last seen on January 28, 1996, leaving her home. When she failed to return home later in the day, she was reported as missing by her family. 2 days later, her body was found off a main road in a ravine in Topanga Canyon. She was assaulted and strangled. Serology evidence was collected from her body, and a DNA profile of the unknown offender was uploaded to the state and federal DNA databases, but a match could not be found. An extensive investigation was completed by the investigators at the time, but it led nowhere and the case went cold. That was until 2019. On November 10, 2019, Los Angeles police arrested a man by the name of Jose Luis Garcia for domestic assault. During the booking process, a DNA swab was taken from Garcia and processed. Investigators then realized that his DNA matched the DNA that was taken from Gladys's body. Detectives then visited Garcia and questioned him about Gladys. The crime took place when he was just 19 years old. They obtained a second DNA swab from him. The Los Angeles Crime Lab were then able to confirm that Garcia's genetic profile matched the unidentified sample taken from Gladys' body in 1996. On September 29, 2020, Garcia was arrested. The police department is still seeking additional information on Garcia. They want to know about other crimes that he may have committed. Anyone with information can call the Los Angeles Regional Crime Stoppers at this number. Garcia has yet to enter a formal plea. His bail is set at $1 million. Detective Hugo Reinaga said, "We are gratified that we were successful in bringing this tragic case to a close." 59-year-old Wilda Wilkinson lived in Bangor, Michigan in 1986. She was a hard-working and loving person. One day, when she did not show up for work, her employer called her two daughters to hear if one of them knew where she was, but they did not know. One of the daughters found Wilda's lifeless body on the floor of her home. She had been strangled. It appeared to investigators that it happened during a break-in. Detectives collected DNA evidence from an unknown man at a crime scene in her home. Despite investigators' best efforts, the case would go cold for many years. In 2010, the case was looked into again. This time, investigators were able to eliminate some people associated with the case and got useful statements from witnesses. In March 2019, investigators traveled to California to question a man by the name of Leon Curry. He had served about 27 years in prison for assault in an unrelated case. Leon had been a person of interest for quite some time because he lived in the same area as Wilda and committed a similar crime. When investigators talked to him this time, he confessed to taking her life. Since a lot of people make false confessions, investigators decided to use DNA testing to make sure what he said is true. His DNA did not match the DNA of the unknown offender, and he was ruled out. Investigators were not done with the DNA they collected back in 1986, however. They entered it into a DNA database and found a match. Using the DNA technology, they identified 50-year-old Robert Wade as the person who took Wilda's life. When investigators went to talk to him, they found him serving time in a Florida prison for unrelated kidnapping and battery charges from 2007. In August of 2020, he confessed to the crime. In October, he was sentenced 25 to 60 years. He was just 16 years old when he ended her life. The day after Valentine's Day, 1991, a woman's body was found in the Florida Keys. She had been assaulted and strangled. Her belongings that were found nearby, and her tan lines indicated that she was not from the area. The woman had a tattoo on her left shoulder, and another one of a tiny cross with sun rays emanating from it on her hand. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen the victim the previous day hitchhiking out of Key West, about 20 miles from where she was found. Detectives followed countless leads over the years. More than 4,000 pages of investigative documentation were amassed. This is the composite drawing created by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The case of Valentine Jane Doe was profiled on a number of television shows, including Unsolved Mysteries. In 2020, Munro County officials looked into the case again. They had heard about other cases being solved with new DNA technology. They entered Valentine Jane Doe's DNA into public DNA databases, which helped them identify her. On June 15, 2020, officials announced that they identified the victim as 18-year-old Wanda Deanne Kirkham of Hornell, New York. Sheriff Rick Ramsey, who worked on the case, said, "This case is a testament and shining example of the agency's commitment to solving crime, no matter how old the case and no matter the challenges." Officials also announced that the person who took Wanda's life had been identified as Robert Lynn Bradley, who lived in Miami at the time of the crime. Bradley's life was taken in April of 1992 in Tarrant County, Texas. Not much is known about him or how his life was taken. but one can only hope that it was as painful as possible. In March of 1999, a newborn baby's lifeless body was found on the side of the road in Cumberland County, North Carolina. The baby was a male. It was determined that he was born less than 24 hours before being found. A Fort Bragg soldier found the baby in a plastic trash bag. At first he believed that he found a doll, but it was not the case. I'm not sure how, but investigators were able to determine that the baby was tossed out of a moving vehicle onto the side of the road. The baby passed away due to blunt force trauma. This case was something personal to the sheriff's office. They were not going to stop until they got it solved. They wanted the baby to have a name for its burial. The baby was named Baby Michael in honor of the patron saint of law enforcement officers. Law enforcement worked hard for the next 20 years to try and find Baby Michael's mom, but they had no luck. Recently, investigators decided to use DNA to find out who she is. Baby Michael's DNA was sent to Bow Technology, a company that specializes in forensic genealogy services. The DNA led investigators to Burke County to interview 54-year-old Deborah Riddle O'Connor. She admitted that she was Baby Michael's mom and that she took his life. She was arrested and booked in the Cumberland County Detention Center, where she is being held without any bond. Her husband said that he married Deborah 10 years ago and he had no idea about the case. He believes his wife has mental issues. If convicted, Deborah faces a punishment of life in prison. Investigators did not release a motive, so we do not know why she did what she did. On January 25, 1986, a woman's body was found in Saline County, Kansas. Her body was located in a creek along the I-70. She became known as Miss Molly. Leads came and went with the years, but investigators were unable to identify her. In 2019, it seemed like the case could possibly be solved. Someone contacted the FBI about a missing woman overseas that could be Miss Molly. Investigators then decided to exhume her grave so that they could get a DNA sample from her. It was believed that she could be one of two women reported missing around 1986. One of them was from the Netherlands and the other from Belgium. In May 2020, the Dutch woman Anna Agnes Neeft's DNA was compared to Miss Molly's DNA, but it was not a match. There was also no match for the woman reported missing from Belgium. Investigators were not done with the DNA, however. After more testing, it led them to 28-year-old Robin Green, who lived in Los Angeles. She was last seen on December 28, 1985, 28 days before her body was found. Michael Green was the last person to see her alive. The couple had been married for some time and had a home together. In December of 1985, the two of them went to Minnesota to visit Robin's 4 children, who lived there with her ex-husband. Michael Green passed away in 2007, so he cannot be questioned regarding his wife's passing. The identity of Miss Molly is now solved, but questions still remain about what happened to her and who took her life. The family never reported her as missing, because back in 1986, the police were looking for Robin and Michael in connection with a drug charge. In 1974, 17-year-old Carla Walker lived in Tarrant County, Texas. She was a cheerleader and on a varsity squad. Her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, was the starting quarterback for his Texas high school team. One evening, the two of them were sitting in his car in the parking lot of the bowling alley. Suddenly, an unknown man holding a gun came up next to the car. The man opened the passenger door and pulled Carla out of the car. He then hit Rodney over the head several times with the gun until he passed out. The attacker then kidnapped Carla. When Rodney woke up, he quickly drove to her house and asked her parents to call the police. 3 days later, her body was found in a ditch. She had been assaulted and tortured before being strangled. DNA of the attacker was found on Carla's clothing, but not much was known about DNA back then, and it was just collected. Suspicion fell on her boyfriend Rodney, as investigators did not believe his story for some reason. Another person that investigators looked into was Glenn Samuel McCurley. He was a person of interest because he had recently purchased a firearm of the same caliber as a magazine found at a crime scene. Glenn told investigators that a firearm had been stolen and denied any involvement in the crime. Even though this was suspicious, investigators could not prove that he or Rodney was responsible. In 2019, the case was looked into again. Investigators decided to make use of DNA to help solve the crime. The DNA of the attacker was entered into GEDmatch. It is a company that makes use of genetic genealogy. It led investigators to brothers by the last name of McCurley. Investigators knew that Glenn McCurley was looked into in the initial investigation. In July of 2020, investigators collected trash from a bin in front of McCurley's home. They were able to determine the items matched the male DNA profile found on Carla's clothing. On September 10, 2020, investigators returned to his home and talked to him and his wife. He told the same story he told detectives back in 1974, that he did not take anyone's life and did not know Carla Walker. He agreed to provide a DNA sample. 6 days later, investigators were notified that his DNA matched the DNA found on Carla's clothing. Glenn was taken into custody without incident. He is currently being held in a Tarrant County jail with bond set at $100,000. Investigators said that they believed the crime was random and Carla and Glenn did not know each other. It appears that over the last 4 decades, Glenn led a relatively normal life. He got married and had 2 children. He is not a suspect in any other crimes. Rodney McCoy has been under a cloud of suspicion for his entire adult life. It has been a long wait for justice for him too. DNA works in both ways. It catches the responsible and exonerates the innocent. In this case, it did both. Dolores Wulff lived in Woodland, California in 1979. She had a husband named Carl. He was an abusive husband. Dolores also had 4 children: Carl Jr., Anna Marie, Tom, and Paul. She worked at Woodland High School as a secretary. Dolores was known for her joyful and positive demeanor, and she would never have left her 4 children. According to her husband, though, that is exactly what she did. Dolores was last seen in August 1979 at her home in Hillcrest Street. When her children asked their father where Dolores was, he told them that she was gone and was never coming back. Detectives from the Yolo County Sheriff's Office immediately started working in the case, trying to find out where she was. They never let the case go, but her disappearance would remain a mystery that haunted her family for more than 4 decades. The family believed that Carl was responsible for her disappearance. Investigators also found incriminating evidence in the family car as well. At one point, Carl was arrested and charged, but never tried. Investigators were sure that he could be convicted if only they had a body. Carl passed away in 2005. While the investigation into her disappearance was ongoing, Investigators at the Benicia Police Department had a mystery of their own. On September 17, 1979, just 6 weeks after her disappearance, sailors discovered a lower torso had washed upon the Carquinez Strait shoreline. Since there were no available fingerprints or dental work to use for comparison, the remains went unidentified, buried as a Jane Doe. The case was looked into again this year. The Yolo County Sheriff's Office partnered with the Doe Network and the Benicia Police Department. The Doe Network is a non-profit organization of volunteers who work with the police to match missing persons to John and Jane Doe cases. 11 women had went missing between Sacramento and San Francisco in 1979 was looked into, as the lower torso that was found might have belonged to them. A DNA swab was collected from one of Dolores' sons. The unidentified remains were exhumed so a DNA could be collected from a femur bone. In October of 2020, investigators received the news that thanks to DNA, it is confirmed that it was Dolores Wulff's body that was found off the shoreline. One of her sons, Tom, had this to say: "I think my first emotion was anger, because of the fact that she was found a month and a half after she disappeared, and we're only finding out now that it was her." Some investigators disagree on if this case is completely solved. Some say that if Carl was still alive, he would be convicted. Others believe that someone else could be the person who took her life.